Okay, for somebody that's sitting there like George, tell me if you can see my top of my head. I think you can. You can see the top of my head? Okay, cool. I should have rubbed the board off, but I do it as we go. So, Hegel. The excerpt, now, I had a very smart question from somebody who was presenting today, and that is, what does the numbers 178, 179 stand for? Those are paragraph numbers. You're reading a very short piece out of this book. So you have the online from Marxist.org excerpt on independence and self-consciousness, Lordship and bondage. It's a small component of the overall book, which is from the Phenomenology of Spirit. Just so you know how big the book is. I thought I'd bring it along. And it's slightly different translation. There's one place where I would use that one. Hegel, and this, okay, so Hegel's crucially important. And he's crucially important because you've got many people responding to Hegel. So you've got Marx obviously responding to Hegel, you've got Nietzsche, you've got people using Hegel like Lacan. You have arguments over what Hegel is saying. The most talked about section of any of Hegel's work is what you've read from the Phenomenology of Spirit. The other, probably most discussed and most taught is philosophy of writing, his work on the stage, which you'll take, I would think, in a fourth-year course, if they're teaching anything on the stage. I know some of my colleagues, like George Commonell, for example, teaches the philosophy of writing, as does David McNally. So this kind of, the piece you've read, the paragraphs you've read, like 178 to 196, need a bit of a setup. And I'm going to give you the setup. And I didn't think it was well spent, time of yours well spent reading the setup. Because I really wanted you to get these few paragraphs where it kind of contains what became Marxist. It's what Marx developed capitalist proletariat, for example, right? So I'm going to set it up, and I also want to say, so that, the film is called Recognition. It's in a desert in Australia. The desert is called the Pinnacles. The two people crawling there, one is me and one is the performance artist Sarah Jane Pell. And we're enacting Misrecognition, actually. So and I'll set it in the context of the, I know it looks like we're just rolling around, but no, we're actually enacting something. And we're wearing Russian pre-World War II, no, I guess Russian gas masks from World War II, because we figured they would serve the purpose. And the purpose was to be, she was using it for a more sort of Mars excerpt she was doing, and I was using it, or I am using it. I actually am also using it for an article with excerpts out of it, but I was also using it for Hegel's Recognition. So, and clearly, we're kind of like look the same, especially with the Russian gas masks. All right. So, before we start, you're going to see I'm going to do it this way. So Hegel makes the distinction between independent and dependent consciousness. The great thing about Hegel is it's going to switch. Okay, so independent and dependent, we're going to say consciousness up here. And on independent, he has the Lord, which is what you've read, the bondsman. And also, at points he calls it depends on the translation, but this calls it both Lord and Master and slave. Now the slave is, and when you get to the next section in Hegel, which I'll touch upon, the slave is basically, and you'll see from this reading, a dependent consciousness. So, although I don't think you can remove the term slave from a historical context, Hegel is attempting to do that, and he talks about it. I mean, he would locate it in history, but the history he's going to locate it in is the move from pagan religion to Christianity and then to the French Revolution. Okay? So he talks about slave consciousness in those terms. But the part you're reading is the development of dependent and independent consciousness. And it fits nicely, I think, with Jacoto's understanding of independent consciousness, or what it means to be your own master, as it does Kant's. So it follows along there. And let me start with what I think Hegel's obsession is, probably because I tend to also read him a bit through Lacan. What I think he's obsessed with is the drive to recognition. So the independence and dependence of self-consciousness, lordship, and bondage, section A in self-consciousness, which is actually a section B, of the Phenomenology of Mind, written in 1807. And that's all in the, you don't really need all of that. That's in the bullet point notes, just to set it up. It's the most famous section of Hegel's work. It's the section on which Marx builds his concepts of class struggle. So when we get to commodity fetishism and alienation, by the end of this term, you'll see the connection there if you don't already sort of see it. It's where Marx builds his concepts, or what he builds his concepts of class struggle and labor from. And it's really what Lacan also develops his understanding of the hysteric from, in terms of recognition. The book, which I brought, consists of, and it's well worth the read. I mean, I don't know if anybody's read the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's sometimes called the Phenomenology of Mind, but the Phenomenology of Spirit. But if you haven't, and you're interested in Hegel, I would use the Miller's translation, which is the one they use on the graduate class. And I would take a look at it. And I would also take a course with Jim Vernon on Hegel, a third-year course, which is excellent. So the book consists of a preface, which he wrote after the book was completed, an introduction. There's 6 major divisions. The major divisions are consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowledge. So in a sense, what he's got is the dialectic, as he understands it, working out through the book. So there's 6 major divisions in the book. Consciousness and self-consciousness. You're reading part A of division B, and a subsection of that, which is self-consciousness. But if you're to take a look at all the divisions, and you don't need to write this down, it's just mostly for your information, right? And they're varying sizes. So you've got consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowledge. Kind of the way the Hegelian dialectic is going to spiral work out. And then these have further subdivisions. So before we get to the section that we're doing, I think what we need to figure out is what self-consciousness means for Hegel. Okay? Because so we have to figure out what self-consciousness means for Hegel. And I think that might even be one of the questions for discussion, I'm not sure. But we're not going to talk about it in the sort of contemporary historical context, right? In the section that you haven't read, and that would be paragraphs 166 to 77, it's called The Truth of Self-Certainty. And what you see here are the dichotomies, the main dichotomies in Hegel's system, and how they synthesize. So the big dichotomy for Hegel is obviously mind-matter. Another one would be, so he's got, you can see this, so the dichotomies, they're going to synthesize. And the thing about Hegel is the dichotomies always synthesize. You've got spirit-nature. You've got infinitude, finitude, and they all sort of are the difference between independent and dependent. And you've got a term that you may not have heard of before, but you may have. These are there are actually 4 key Hegel terms. You've got a for itself, and an in itself. The for itself has consciousness, has self-consciousness. You've also got universal and particular. And these would be sort of the key dichotomies in Hegel. The ones that are most important for what we're doing are the for itself and the in itself. So the opposite then of spirit is nature, and mind is matter, for itself is in itself, of infinitude is finitude, of universal is particular, and they're going to come together in a synthesis. So for Hegel, because Hegel's the dialectical thinker, right? So for Hegel, opposites are opposites, but they're also identical in a way. So they're both opposite and identical. So in each opposite or polarity, so that is in spirit and in nature, there's a difference. But there's also an identity that's going to comprehend the difference. Now this identity of identities is what he's going to call absolute spirit. Because remember, Hegel's moving towards absolute spirit. The realization, the manifestation of absolute spirit in history. And part of absolute spirit, I'll talk more about it at the end, but part of absolute spirit is the coming together of identity and difference. But in a difference, okay? So, just to back up. So for Hegel, there are opposites. But the opposites are also identical. And in the opposite, there's difference, obviously, but there's also an identity. And that identity is going to comprehend the difference. So this identity of identities, absolute spirit, is the comprehension of all differences. What that means is differences are included and they're absorbed. And it's taken to another level. You're sitting in a different place. It's like, so for example, if you want to take an example, one of the best examples for Hegel, I mean, look, his dialectic is going to go like this. I just read that off. Okay. His dialectic is going to go, if you start with being, there's going to be a negation of that. If you get stuck in the negation, you're kind of stuck in nihilism. And if you get through the negation, you get to becoming. And becoming is then going to start another being, negation, becoming. So that in a sense, is this kind of circular direction of his dialectic. Until you get to attaining, until absolute spirit is manifest in the world. Which it never is, basically. So being, where Hegel starts out, is simple fluid substance, a pure movement. So in the part you didn't read, he talks about being and the most simplest aspect of being, which is this basic substance. I like to call it primordial slime. But you can call it primordial substance, because that's what he's working with. That's one of the reasons we're sat in the desert there, sort of rising out of primordial substance, simple fluid substance, except it's not fluid. But for Hegel, primordial substance, or simple substance, is substance of pure movement that happens within itself. And in that substance, a pure movement, what you get are shapes coming out of it. So you've got shapes that are part of it, are then moving out of it. So they're differentiating into independent shapes. The unity of the fluid substance and pure movement is an infinite unity. The substance is infinite, and the shapes end up being dividedness within the substance, or matter, or nature, if you want to call it that. So the shapes are both part of the unity and divided from the unity. They're both identity and difference. So what happens in the preamble to what you read, the truth of self-consciousness, is this working out of the dialectic. So he's sort of showing the working out of dialectical logic, which posits self-consciousness. I rubbed it off. Oh, there it is. Okay, which posits self-consciousness as arising out of primordial substance and taking form. So self-consciousness is dividing from the unity of primordial substance, and it's taking form. And when this happens, according to Hegel, the entity is on its way to differentiating itself from being merely an in itself to becoming a for itself. But it's still an in itself. So as it differentiates, as it takes on a shape, it's on its way to differentiating itself from being merely an in itself, that's part of the universal, to becoming a for itself. It's going to negate simple being as substance. So it's becoming is going to negate simple being as substance. You get being, negation, only to reach a new synthesis made up of being. So you go being, negation, becoming being, and it goes continuous until, and some people stop the Hegelian dialectic, some don't. Some people stop the Hegelian dialectic with the argument of the realization of absolute idea in history, which at sort of the end of history, which some people argue could have been the Prussian state for Hegel. But I don't really want to go with that, because that's a historical manifestation of where Hegel was in history. What's interesting to me on his dialectic is the process of being, negation. So an in itself is negated, and so you've got universal substance. The rising up of the shapes, which are in themselves, they're rising up out of substance, out of primordial substance, then produces a for itself, becoming, which then starts again. And it keeps going. So then you can have different aspects of becoming. Does that make sense, or do you want me to take another run at it? Because, the synthesis is basically, you've got universal substance. You've got shapes which are, in themselves, rising up. At a certain point, they're going to act as a for itself. They're going to become a for itself. That is an independent actor. And when they rise up, it's a negation. The becoming is a for itself, and then it starts again. And so you can play the Hegelian dialectic with no end, or you can play it with an end in history, where it would start again. So if you want to do a Marxist application, the end in history could be proletarian revolution, then the dialectic will have to start again. So I find it pretty hard to end a dialectic. So this becoming negates simple being as substance and reaches a new synthesis made up of being, negation, becoming. So what you're going to have is a new synthesis. So once you go here, then you're going to have a new synthesis and start again. And that's kind of Hegel's dialectic in a nutshell. Now, what's really important in Hegel's dialectic is this drive for recognition. But self-consciousness, the move from an in itself to a for itself. So an in itself is a dependent consciousness, a for itself is an independent consciousness. This move from an in itself to a for itself, what prompts it, how self-consciousness begins is with this desire for recognition. That what drives it is a desire for recognition. Quote, self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself in that and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it exists only by being acknowledged or recognized. And that would be paragraph 184 to about 195, where he talks about that. I think that's closer to 195. Self-consciousness desires recognition in order to attain self-certainty. So what you've got is the struggle between two self-consciousnesses, two self-conscious entities, which you see going on here. For Hegel, what results is one becoming the independent consciousness, or the Lord or the Master, and the other becoming the dependent consciousness, bondsman or slave. Now, the two entities in the film vignette are involved in a struggle for recognition. We try to shoot it so that they're similar in body, attire, hair, and not have distinct human facial structures. And they emerge, they're emergent, and they're crawling out of what could be Hegel's primordial substance, in which the dominant geographical scape consists of, the geological scape actually consists of sand and rock-shaped pinnacles. It's called pinnacles. And they were found like naturally. So each of the two entities in the film is involved in a struggle to become a for itself. What's happened thus far is that they have differentiated as independent consciousnesses apart from the pinnacle substance of existence. But that's not enough for Hegel. They've made it out of nature. They've differentiated from nature in a sense as independent in itself, but they haven't become a for itself. Their desire for recognition by another is not happening. Rather, what you're getting is a misrecognition. And just to say a little bit about the other person that's in the video with me, Sarah Jane Pell is a research artist at NASA. She's an underwater performance artist, and she specializes in extreme environments. I mean, this was not an extreme environment. We were just doing this, but she actually specializes in her work in extreme environments. So, top of, what's the famous mountain, Mount Everest? She did that. She did underwater performance. She's an underwater, worked on underwater oil rigs as a scuba diver and does underwater performance as a scuba diver. So she, in a sense, she's really cool. So she, in a sense, really acts as a for itself in her environment, you know? And where we're just trying to show like Hegel's emergent in itself, becoming for itself, but not ending with recognition to keep the dialectic going. So for Hegel, and I'll return to this, and I want to go through the moments again, but self-consciousness can be satisfied only in another self-consciousness. That it can only be satisfied by recognition by another. Now then it gets weird. And if you read Kojève, it even gets weirder. Because we used to do Kojève in this class. I was the only person that liked Kojève. Everyone was like, oh, this again, right? But I thought Kojève was pretty awesome in terms of like what came out of his lectures. Okay, so Kojève taught Hegel to very famous French theorists. Lacan, Bataille. Sartre refused to sit in his lectures because he didn't want to be influenced. Somebody else that was quite famous that they used Kojève to develop their theory. So, for self-consciousness, what you've got is this relation, and think about it. I mean, this is actually a really simple concept, but it's really important. One of the things that psychologically drives us as humans, and you know, Hegel was on to this, and then Freud picks it up, and Lacan picks it up, is this desire for recognition, okay? So in a sense, if you're giving somebody non-recognition, you're not recognizing them as another for itself. You're keeping them at the level of a in itself. So you know, like when your mom says, you know, that's it, because usually moms would say this, that's it, I'm not talking to you, you don't exist for me. Okay, bingo, you're an in itself. You know, and then usually what happens is you try to get back to the for itself status, right? You try to get a you try to get a recognition. That's what he's talking about. And it's so Hegel's idea of recognition, which is a dialectical recognition, is kind of at the core of psychoanalysis too. So the relation of these two conscious and self-conscious individuals is that they prove themselves to each other. They prove to themselves and to each other, and they do so, Hegel says, through a life and death struggle. And the life and death struggle is there's going to be a winner and loser. Now, what gets interesting, I think, for Hegel, and why his dialectic goes somewhere, is that in the struggle, one entity is not afraid to risk death. And the entity not afraid to risk death becomes the master. But Hegel's not on the master-lord side, okay? The entity that's afraid to risk and doesn't want to die is forced to submit. And they become temporarily the slave. But for Hegel, it's the slave, the bondsman, the initially dependent consciousness that represents the fear of death. And it's this consciousness that marks the dawn of civilization, the dawn of the subject. That is to say, as a subject for Hegel, what marks an in itself becoming a for itself as a subject is fear of death. Which is why somebody like Nietzsche likes Hegel in his own way, and it's why existentialists like Hegel, and it's why Heidegger, it's this, the fact what makes us a subject is fear of death. Animals don't apparently have fear of death. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know. I mean, they don't obviously have the name death, right? They don't have the concept death. But if you've been with animals when they were dying, it's hard. I don't know. So if anybody's got anything on whether animals have a fear of death or not, I'd be very interested in that. The claim is they don't. They do? I was going to say, I would think they did in a way, but they wouldn't call it death because they don't have that kind of language. But what do you got?
Actually, last night I saw this video of, I think it was an orangutan who was 59 years old. Her name's like Mona or something. And she realized that she was ill.
Yeah.
So she started refusing food and drink.
Okay.
Because she knew she was dying and she was really weak. So she started refusing it. And then in order for her to not have a horrible death, because she's like a beloved, subject of a couple of research things and whatever, they brought back her old trainer or something.
Ah, that's so sweet.
He was a doctor, and when he heard her voice, when she heard his voice, she just started eating again.
Wow. That's really amazing. So they have, animals have a lot. That's really an interesting example, actually. So they have a lot of recognition. Animals actually probably have better recognition skills than we do. It's hard to tell if that indicated willingness of going through the biological. Because part of the problem as humans is when you're dying, you've been, your whole body and conceptually has been programmed to live, right? So you end up with that fight against the dying. Whereas, I don't know, it sounds like in that example, which I don't want to generalize from this, but in that example, it looks like she figured out she was sick and was going to go with that. Some humans do that too. So yeah, I would probably phrase this to say humans are the only creatures that have a name for the process. We could go with that, because then it puts them in language, and that makes it easier. I don't know. Yeah, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, it's tough for us to give qualities to animals without actually being the animal itself.
Yeah, that doesn't stop us with other things, though. But yes, it really is, right? You don't know. And because animals also are very good at signing, there's certain, they understand, there's a whole bunch of everything they understand, so they've got a very strong recognition, understanding. It's just the not human language. I have trouble with that too, right? I have trouble with how to phrase that. Yeah. So.
Just a question about what you were saying earlier. Can you explain the fear of death and civilization part?
The fear of death?
And civilization.
Okay, so look. One of the things that Hegel says, and one of the reasons I think he's so brilliant, and I'll just bracket that, and I'll take that in a second. I'm going to go to Paul, because I'm going to get to that, and I want to do it in a miniature form, and then I'll, yeah, Paul.
The only thing that comes to mind is like a possum. So like whenever
A what?
A possum. So
Okay.
when it's scared, it actually faces its own death. Right? It just
That's great.
Yeah, right? So
There you are.
in that sense, it kind of senses its own death. Like then it plays that it is dead when it can actually get it, right? So, but even so, I guess like animals have that like fight or flight sense.
Yes, okay,
So,
that works. And the thing, the problem is, we can only, I think you nailed it before, we can only understand it in the context of our own discourses of humans, right? So, certainly they have, those in control and those not in control, but then you also have like all sorts of weird things happening cross species, of like some species saving another just because they're weak. Like, you have a whole bunch of stuff going on, so it's probably humans just can't understand it, which I'm willing to go along with. I have less trouble with the death question, because I can answer that in terms of Hegel's human language, right? Did you find out as well? Yeah, no, okay. So look, for Hegel, in order for somebody to be a subject, you have to be aware of the fact you could die. You have to, now, who knows if he's right or not, but that's his claim. There's two components that make the slave become the next becoming. One is this fear of death, and the other is the moment when the bondsman looks around and realizes that all the things of the world they have made. And for Hegel, without the fear of death and the recognition that all the objects of the world are made by you, and then becoming for itself through that recognition, that will overthrow the master. That will overthrow the independent consciousness. Now, you could argue, and because he says basically without the fear of death, we can't produce history. That all the master can do is like risk everything again and again and again. But can't can't create history and culture. Now you could say he was wrong. And he could be wrong, I don't know. But in order to be fully human for Hegel, you have to have this fear of death. You have to have a fear. He says it's fear of death, fear of destruction of self, negation that humanizes. And you might say, okay, well, the reason for that is that's his key contradiction component in the dialectic, negation. So if negation is your key force, contradiction and negation is your key force in the dialectic, then negation, fear of death, fear of destruction of self is going to be the operative principle of history and of the dawn of the subject. So it's fear of death for Hegel, fear of destruction of self, that it's a negation that humanizes. Now he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, the experience of imagining one's own destruction and the destruction of the world isn't something given to the animal. And this experience of imagining one's own destruction and the destruction of the world is an experience that the less fearful, the less human master or leader avoids. So for Hegel, fear of destruction of self is the essence of the human. And you can see then how that can play into a number of different thinkers. But it's fear of destruction of self for him is the essence of human. Now I want to go back. So that would be, that's where we're going with that. To go back, I want to go back to the universal substance, and I want to build it up again. But before I do that, because I want to do a second run at adding some more stuff. Is everybody clear in the direction it's going? Any questions, comments? You're suspicious, probably rightly so, of the fear of death being that which marks you at the dawn of the subject. But it's a historical dialectic. He's got both the Hegelian dialectic, which is the format of being, negation, becoming, and then he's mapping that onto history. And then he's making up prehistory from history texts as it goes. Basically, like all theorists end up doing. Yeah?
Just wanted to ask, how does this Hegelian concept relates to what do you call it, emancipation and the Enlightenment in which we can...
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. So it relates two ways. It's the two components: the fear of death, which humanizes, and the idea that it's through your work that's built up the world. And once you recognize, in Marxist terms, once you recognize there's a revolution, right? Now, Fanon has something interesting to say about this because he says it's not, and he's right, it's not that people haven't recognized that they have built, they have built the buildings, they've done the crops, they've done the culture. It's that they can't effectively overthrow the leaders who have no fear of death and have all the, as you go on through history, have all the capitalist arsenal of war machines at their disposal. So Fanon he uses the Hegelian dialectic, but he says there's a problem because it's not just recognition. I mean, the first step is you recognize, but then you have to be able to overthrow. And so that's where, and you can really see that, like, people are smart, right? So people know, you've all had jobs where you know right off you're being exploited. You all go into places where the person working there knows that they're like being exploited in terms of, working too hard, not getting, like all of this, having like nasty supervisors, all that kind of stuff. It's not that they don't know, it's that they don't at that point have the means to overthrow it. And that's why it's really important to have Fanon inserted into the Hegelian dialectic. Because otherwise you end up blaming for itself for once you recognize, hey, I created the world that was my work and my brother's work and my sister's work and like that produced it. If they don't make a change, then the blame is sort of on, it kind of freezes the dialectic. Freezes the dialectic. There has to be reasons for not making that change. And usually the reason for not making the change is not non-recognition, it's power structures. And Hegel, you can put that into Hegel. He doesn't actually put it in there himself, particularly in Phenomenology of Spirit. More in the philosophy of right when he talks about the state. You can kind of see it entering in there. Carmen? No. Oh, you're just like, okay, so person sitting beside, it's not Amanda because she's there. Catherine, I was getting there. Okay.
If it's circular and if it's constantly...
And spiral.
And does it mean that with every kind of cycle you go higher, or is it a...
That's the Enlightenment idea. But you can slip back. Okay. But for Hegel, yes, until you get to absolute spirit. So it's what he calls sublation, and going to the next level, and sublation. So you take in the contradiction, you hold identity, and the difference changes that you take in the contradiction in the negation, and you go higher. So I mean, really, if I put it this way for a reason, because I don't believe that the dialectic necessarily goes up. But it would be inverted. So becoming and then being, but since it's circular, but yeah, the idea is taken to the next level, is taken to the next level, until you reach the absolute idea. Now the absolute idea for Hegel seems to be back to the Prussian state. Okay? Where you've got, and you could inject Kant in there, so his absolute idea is like a cosmopolitan state and universal, okay. They're all playing around that area. And they're all trying to come up with something that, okay, let me try and phrase this right, that is universal, that is going to involve recognition of for itself as for itself. And you've also got people who are sitting in a very privileged position that they don't want to lose. So you've got, and that's really the problem with a lot of theory. Because even I would say, though the theorists don't know it, they're not conscious of it, they really are hemmed in by their position, their place in history. So, Hegel sees himself and German, because he's living in Germany, he sees himself and German and Prussian history as the absolute idea working itself out. He just happened to be sitting there. Now, what's really, I'll say this and then I'll get back to the lecture. What's really, really, really wrong with that is, and we can't judge people by standards today. But if you're going to talk about universal history, I think you have to be someplace other than the center. Because if you're not someplace other than the center, what you're really doing is universal imperialist history, without calling it that. And, most of the theorists, until you get, once we start Lacan and Butler, that doesn't happen. But certainly with Hegel and Kant, that really plays. And I like to try and teach or go through Hegel without saying that, but I don't even think it's valid. I think what you need to, and I think you've all nailed it, so I don't think I need to tell you, you need to realize Hegel's sitting at a particular point in history. His dialectic doesn't have to stay there, okay? And it doesn't have to only go spiral up. It can go back, and it can go forward. And it can be altered the way Said's going to talk about it. It can be altered by different theorists that use it. So what I'd say I'm trying to do is say two concepts of Hegel's. The dialectic and his concept of recognition, which I think is quite brilliant in terms, and has had a lot done with it. So if you go back then, is that good for the questions or no? Because I'm going to go back and sort of do it again and add stuff to it. So when you go back to just before what you read, he talks about this material subsistence. And he's trying, what you might have as a takeaway here is how these theorists are knocking themselves out to try and get something that happens. It's ridiculous in a way. They're knocking themselves out to try and come up with something that happens before the history they know. So, in contract theorists, you get states of nature. So Hegel's giving you a primordial substance to get to where he's going. Now, what do we know about that? The states of nature, the primordial substance. I'm sure you know. We know that they're always imaged in history. Okay? So a state of nature, it's no coincidence that, Locke or Hobbes or Rousseau's state of nature kind of looks like what you would imagine a state of nature to be in at the time they were writing. And, Hegel's trying to come up with this universal substance, and he's not doing bad, because he gets to, primordial substance. He gets to the idea that out of this substance you're going to have shapes that are coming out of it. They're both part of the universal substance. They're both part of this moment, what he's going to call the moment of being. They're both part of that, and as they emerge as a shape, there's a second moment of becoming, which is going to negate the universal substance. And you've got a difference. You've got a shape that's a difference. So life in this simple universal fluid medium is a passive separating out of shapes. The other term that Hegel's really important for is action. Okay, so what motivates his dialectic is movement and action. So, recognition and action and a dialectic that's continuous are probably the three things that we can really use, I would say, from Hegel. And maybe fear of death. So it's this action. The identity of negation contains, so you've got this universal substance, you're part of universal being, and you emerge as some sort of shape. And it's a negation of universal being, and the emergence of some sort of shape is an action. It's an action initially as in itself, moving towards becoming a for itself. And it's action that really motivates the changes in the dialectic, and it's action that motivates the changes in Marx's dialectic. So this simple universal fluid medium is this in itself. And as the shapes come out of it, they become a for itself, but not a for itself with recognition. The simple substance of life is the splitting up of itself into differences. And he uses shapes here for differences. Now, what to take away from that, and I'll give it a rest on the universal substance after this, okay? But what to take away from that is this splitting up into shapes. This differentiating into shapes is both part of the universal substance and a difference. For Hegel, it's always both. When you move to the next, when the action moves, when you negate, you always take something of the new becoming into the negation, and it's taken into the next new becoming. That he's got this continuity that when we differentiate, we take something of what we're differentiating with the differentiation. So he's moving in his dialectic. You see Hegel moving constantly towards absolute spirit, the identity of all identities. I would say he never gets there. At a certain point, he slams in the Prussian state as a manifestation of it. And I think it's a mistake, actually, to sort of end the dialectic. Because if you end it, what you've got is absorption of all differences. And really what becomes important in Hegel's dialectic is the holding of difference, the holding of sameness inside difference, and the moving to the next stage and carrying forward. So what you read, 177, I'm just going to check the time to make sure we're good. Yeah, we're good. On 177, he starts with spirit. Oh, you got 178, so you haven't got that. So spirit is the absolute substance, which is the unity of the difference in independent self-consciousness. So spirit, absolute spirit, is this unity of all differences. Now, I would say bracket that. I mean, recognize that that's what he's talking about. Recognize that that's where he's going. But his dialectic probably works best if it doesn't get there. So what one witnesses happening in the preamble section, before we get to the section you read, is his working out of dialectical logic. And the working out of dialectical logic, the way he does it, is he posits self-consciousness that comes out of being as substance. When a shape arises, it negates being, but it's coming out of being, so it contains being. It both negates and contains. So it negates, but this negation is included in that which is negated. It negates being, but the negation is included in being. The negation is negated by the idea of becoming, which includes both. So, to make a long story short. Exactly, okay. So to make this long story short, becoming really is the negation of being. And the negation of being contains part of what is being negated. So in becoming, there is both being and negation. Now, I don't know what it's like listening to a lecture on Hegel, but it's super fun giving it. Just so you know. You know, Hegel's so much more fun than Kant. And it's super fun because it's just, his dialectic works. And he's got it solidly put out there in the section before you read, the one you read. When you get to the one you read, it's all about recognition. And it's all about the rise of self-consciousness. So to go back to what he says at the very beginning of 178, which is where you come in, and I thought I would save you from the universal substance. I have had it as a reading before, included. Certainly, if you go to where you downloaded this, it's just the section before. Take a look at it. 171 to 77, I think. You come in with self-consciousness. And self-consciousness begins with this desire for recognition. And he goes so far as to suggest that self-consciousness is recognition. Beginning of 178 paragraph. Self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself in that, and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it's only by being acknowledged or recognized that you have self-consciousness. It's a movement. It's desire for recognition and movement out of matter in motion. Now, other theories that picked up the idea of humans being, Bergson, for example, sees humans as matter in motion. Deleuze sees humans as matter in motion. So that comes out of Hegel. I mean, Hegel's got a very strong technical influence of social and political philosophy and thought. So desire for recognition and movement out of matter in motion or infinite substance. That's what it is. Self-consciousness is desire for recognition. It's desire for recognition by the other. It's desire for movement out of matter in motion or infinite substance. So you've got, in the realm of spirit, you've got free being. And that's a being that operates as a self-conscious being that exists and acts for itself. And you have it in itself. And if you're a being that's stuck at the stage of an in itself, you're being determined by mere nature. You're not acting out of consciousness of self, but you're being acted upon. So you're being an in itself rather than a for itself, and you're being for another. And you say, there's something wrong with that. And you're right. Because what that doesn't take into account is the power structure. So in many aspects of our lives, we act as in itself. That doesn't mean that we're in itself, because we recognized, we're self-conscious, but there's a power structure that's keeping us as being acted upon. So let's do an example on the college strike right now. Do a contemporary example. So Seneca College is on strike. And you can argue that whatever job you're working for, in terms of a contract, you're kind of working as an in itself until the contract becomes up for negotiations. Then you make negotiations, you can act as a for itself. And an action that could bring about a new contract could be a strike. That's an action. So you can apply Hegel's dialectic there. You can say that often in our work lives we are in ourselves. We have potential for being for ourselves. When we act as a for ourselves, we're bringing out action that's making a change. And we act as a for ourselves by recognizing, like, hey, this college, Seneca College, because Seneca's on strike, Seneca College would not exist except for the people that are teaching it, right? So that would be bringing it to a for itself. Yeah, what's up?
So is the only difference between the in itself and the for itself just the recognition?
It's recognition and action. Okay? Now, so that's a really excellent question. Because you've got three things. You've got fear of death. And then you've got recognition that everything around you you're responsible for building, you and others. And then you've got action. And the action to move from an in itself to a for itself may involve a number of things, including revolution. And you may lose. But while you're fighting a revolution, I'm just adding, this isn't Hegel, this is me. While you're fighting a revolution, you're totally acting as a for itself. And so you think of the Cuban Revolution, and then you bring in a new government, you're still a for itself, and then at some point it becomes an in itself.
So
Yeah.
it's personal recognition, not recognition from others.
Recognition from, but you're right. Okay, so that's also important. It's like recognition of self as a self-consciousness, recognition of self and others, and recognition by others. Okay, so remember the Aventine example. I think it was from last week or the week. It was from Rancière, where the plebeians are on the hill and counselor comes out, the general comes out to talk to them, and he recognizes them as an other. He hails them into, the act of recognition. He recognizes them as speaking, intelligent human beings, as people who have to be listened to. So that's a recognition of an other. They, of course, had self-recognition and had recognized themselves as for itself by making that demand. Does that make sense? So it has to be, so you've got a complex thing working there. You've got fear of death, recognition that you built the world. Then you have to have recognition of the other. And it's in getting that recognition of others that becomes a problem. Because that's where the power structure is going to come in. So the Aventine example is very interesting because what you get is a Roman general going out and speaking to them, and in doing that, they're recognized as subjects, speaking subjects who are capable of reason and who have the right to speak and listen and be spoken to. And so that's where the recognition will come in. That's a really good example of that. Because he's got a two-thing of self-consciousness. And maybe I can make it simpler by saying that you become a for itself by recognizing that you've produced your surroundings, that it's your work and your knowledge. And then you become a self-conscious by being satisfied in another's self-consciousness, that is recognized by another. But if we all recognize as a group that we produce something, then that is recognition of others. And if we bond together to overthrow something, that is recognition of others in terms of you as a self. And then you may not get recognition by the force you've bonded together to overthrow. However, fighting back could be seen as recognition. That their use of military, their use of police forces, their use to keep you from achieving it could be seen as a form of recognition, not the one you necessarily want. But paragraph 178. So I'm going to take you through the self-consciousness, which starts at 179. And it really kind of touches on what Uzo was asking, and that is self-consciousness desires recognition in order for self-certainty. So self-certainty comes from interaction with the other. So there has to be an other. So the struggle between two self-consciousness, for Hegel, two self-consciousnesses there, for Hegel, results in one person becoming the independent consciousness. I'm taking you through this again, but through the reading part of it. Becoming the independent consciousness, the other becoming the dependent consciousness. So what you've got is one person becoming the Lord Master, independent consciousness, the other person becoming the bondsman, slave, dependent consciousness, because in the fight to death, they were scared of dying. So from the beginning, negation then is the beginning of freedom. If you take a look at sections, they're paragraphs 184 to 90. And he talks again about the life and death struggle. So the relation of the two self-conscious individuals is that they have to prove themselves and each other, to go back to your question. They have to prove both themselves and each other through this life and death struggle. They have to engage in the struggle. They must raise their certainty of being for themselves, and they have to raise it to the level of what Hegel would call a truth. They have to risk, on paragraph 187, the individual that has not risked his life. They'll get recognized as a person, but they won't be recognized as, part of this recognition won't be as an independent self-consciousness. So you fought, I've pulled back because I'm scared of dying. I'm also scared of getting hurt. Okay, so probably more than, I don't know. Okay, I pull back because I'm scared of dying, but getting hurt and then dying. I'm still a person. person, but I'm not recognized by the other as an independent self-consciousness. So in this hypothetical struggle, so Hegel's got this hypothetical struggle. One entity is not afraid to die, and that entity becomes the master. The entity who is afraid to die is forced to submit and becomes the dependent consciousness. As we said before, for Hegel, it's this dependent consciousness, the bondsman, the slave, who is more fully human than the master because of fear of death. And this fear of dying is what makes people human. And you're thinking, that's really austere. If it's like fear of death marks the dawn of the human subject. It's the experience of imagining your own destruction and the destruction of the world is what makes you human. The animal doesn't do this, we think. But who knows? Certainly animals understand in their own terms death and the death of a loved one. So, fear of destruction of self is for Hegel the essence of what it means to be human. You know, fear of destruction of self. And I remember this when I'm in like a swim lane and somebody is like going like crazy behind me and they're bigger than me. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I'm scared. But that's just because I'm human. And they usually don't swim over top of me, so it's okay. Though it's an interesting thing when somebody does, just like that. Okay, so this fear of self-negation for Hegel is what he considers the essence of the human. And you can say, hey, that's not a bad essay topic. Taking a look at what thinkers see as being the essence of the human. And for Hegel, it is like fear of self-destruction. Or fear of destruction of self. Fear of destruction of self is really an appearance of pure subjectivity. Okay, so once you die, once you've been destroyed, what you get is like a pure subjectivity and the infinite. Because of course Hegel's also sort of Christian. Okay? So once your finitude, which is you as a person, once that's lost, what you end up in is infinitude, where your own particularity has been canceled. So you've still got, it just works good in terms of finitude is part of infinitude, but it's separate, particular, and different from it. It's a negation of it, but when that ends, a becoming will send you back to a different type of infinitude. So once the negation of the essence of the human happens, what you've got is pure subjectivity and infinitude for Hegel. So negation is the cancellation of any particularity. Now, once you discover, and this goes back to part of Uzo's question there, once you discover that, you're going to die. I mean, do you remember when you figured out you were going to die? And if you haven't figured it out, probably should think about it for 2 minutes and then let it go. But I remember being a little kid and realizing, I think my granddad died or something. And I realized, oh my God, I'm not going to be like, this is not going to go on forever. That's terrible. And then all of that, right? And then you start crying because it's your granddad, but really you're crying because, oh my God, it's going to happen to me. And you kind of discover your own death. And this negation then, and this is very much what the existentialists picked up like Sartre, Camus, the negation is actually a form of freedom. Negation is also freedom for Hegel. Because you realize at the moment you realize I'm capable of dying, then you get this freedom where you realize you're not any of the particularities and specificities that you've identified with. So the subject then is not for Hegel, because he's got this Christian component. And there is Christian readings of Hegel, actually. So the subject is not its body, it's not its sensations, it's not its thoughts. Instead, it is this infinitude that has been marked as finitude. And that would be where you go with the Christian Hegel. I'm going to move back. I'm going to go back to sort of the Marxist Hegel. Death is essential to self-conscious life for Hegel. That negation and death are the core of the subject. And they're also the moving principle. Negation, in a sense, is death of what went before. So negation and death are similar. So negation is death of being, and what you get is a becoming. They're the core of the subject. They're the moving principle. Negation is the moving principle of dialectical development. So to live, and I'm sure you guys recognize this, to live as a mind or a spirit or a mind, body, spirit, it's the opposite of spirit, matter. Okay, mind, body, spirit, matter. To live as like we live. We're constantly, at a biological level and at an intellectual level, negating what we were before. Your cells do it. I mean, you don't even have to be aware of it, right? Your skin, like the whole thing does it. So this discovery of death and negation is the discovery of being for itself, and then what you add to that is action. So you've discovered your being for yourself. Now you have to become a self-conscious, independent consciousness. It's tricky because the master, lord, person in charge, I don't know what you want to call them, independent consciousness exists for itself. But in order to exist, it requires the recognition of those who it's dominating. It gets even trickier. So the Lord, Master, Leader, independent consciousness is going to achieve their recognition through another consciousness. And to recognize this other consciousness has to put aside its own being for itself. And when it puts aside its own being for itself, it works 14 hours and lives in bad conditions, or works 8 hours and lives in good conditions, but puts it aside, what they're doing to themselves is precisely what the Lord, Master, Leader, independent consciousness does to it. This is where there's a difference in translation. On paragraph 191, in this translation, it says, and in yours it says something slightly different. I like this one better because I think it hits harder. So in this one, it says, for recognition proper is at the very end of 191. So you take a look at what you've got on the printout here, and I'll tell you where it's different. So it says, but for recognition proper, there is needed, this is the one you've got, there is needed the moment that what the master does to the other, he should also do to himself. What it says in here is, but for recognition proper, the moment is lacking, that what the Lord does to the other, he also does to himself. And what the bondsman does to himself, he should also do to the other. Here it says, but for recognition proper, there is needed the moment that what the master does to the other, he should also do to himself. In the bigger text, it's the Lord or master achieves his recognition, and what the Lord or master does to the other, he also does to himself. What the bondsman slave does to himself, he should also do to the other. So there's a should removed, which is I think kind of interesting. He also does to himself, whereas here it's he should. In the one you read, he should. What they're both trying to get at is recognition is one-sided and unequal. That is, it's not good for either side. The master is recognized by a dependent consciousness in order to be fully a master, leader, Lord, whatever you want to put in quotation marks there. He needs to be recognized by an independent consciousness in order to be certain of his being for himself or for himself. The problem is the truth of the independent consciousness is really the dependent consciousness of where's the dependent consciousness? I rubbed it off. But the dependent consciousness of the bondsman. And what you've got is the Hegelian dialectic in play. Just as the master ends up showing that the essential nature, its essential nature, is the reverse of what it wants to be, that is recognized as a strong for itself, the servitude of the bondsman slave turns into the opposite of what it is. It turns into a for itself. He says, as consciousness forced back upon itself, it will withdraw into itself and be transformed into an independent consciousness. So that's where self-consciousness is going to arise. As a consciousness forced back upon itself, it's going to withdraw into itself as a dependent consciousness and be transformed into an independent consciousness through recognition. Servitude contains within itself a pure negativity. The whole being has been seized with fear. Okay, so you're afraid. But in your work, according to Hegel, Marx, it'll be labor. In your work, in your labor, the slave rids themselves of attachment to natural existence. That's 195, paragraph 195. Through work, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he is. But the third line down on 195. Through work and labor, this consciousness of the bondsman comes to itself. Then he gives one of the best definitions of work. He says, I want to make sure I can find it for you. It's in 195. Yeah, there it is. He calls it labor. Labor is desire restrained and checked. Okay. Work is desire. Work, what we create in the world, if you get to Freud, is what we create in the world is sublimation of life instincts, of sexual instincts. Work is desire held in check. What work does is it forms and shapes the things of the world. So when you form and shape something, you put yourself into it. You know how Marx talks about how the worker producing an object puts part of themselves into the object in terms of their labor? It comes from Hegel. What Hegel says here in 195, in shaping the thing, in fashioning the thing, the bondsman's negation of being for self becomes an object for him. That the bondsman, they have shaped the object in the outside world and it confronts them as an object. Marx uses that and develops it in terms of labor. It comes out of 195 here in Hegel. The bondsman realizes then that being for the self belongs to them. The bondsman realizes that it's precisely their work where it seemed that they only had an alienated existence. This is from 195. That they acquire a mind of their own. It's in the discipline of work and the obedience of working, he says obedience, service, that transforms fear. So without this formative activity, fear is going to remain inward, and consciousness is not going to become a for itself. But with formative activity, with the production of things, with work in the external, and realizing that that work and thing is what is coming back to alienate you, you achieve a for itself consciousness, self-consciousness. Humans are self-consciousness, according to Hegel. It's what makes the human different from animals. And again, I want to bracket that. I think because animals don't have the concept of self. They probably, I don't know if they have a concept of I. Certainly, on Friday night dinners, Molly has a real concept of injustice. This is a friend of mine's dog. Has a real concept of injustice because she has to sit in her mat. And there's the reason she has to sit in her mat when we eat dinner. She used to be able to roam around and pick up what was on the ground, right? Which was like really cool because I'm pretty sloppy. But there's a small, like, a baby who's a year old. And the baby, of course, there's lots of stuff on the floor, and they're scared she's going to upset the high chair, right? So she has to sit there until everything's done, and she will usually give a speech every time. Right? At a certain point, she'll just give a speech. So she's got a consciousness of injustice, right? But I don't know if there's a consciousness of I. that humans become conscious of themselves the first time they say I. And desire is a necessary condition of self-consciousness. Desire is necessary for Hegel because it moves us to action. So this desire for recognition moves us towards action. And without desire for recognition, we're not going to have action. Action is born out of desire. Action transforms the desired object. It either transforms it or destroys it. And to go back to dialectic, all action is a negation of what was there before. All action is negated. Human desire satisfies itself by negating what was there before. We've got about 10 minutes. Are you guys okay for 10 minutes? Do you want to stretch or something? Because I know I'm having a lot of fun, but I know it's hard listening for like out to Hegel. Okay, so human desire satisfies itself by negating, by transforming, by changing. And all human desire that generates self-consciousness is desire for recognition. Hegel has located this desire for recognition in this mythical fight to the death for recognition. Okay? So he wants to say, look, humans function according to a desire for recognition. And when we use this desire to put action into the world and negate what's there and act as a for itself, this is driven by a desire to be recognized by others. Moving from self-recognition to recognition from others. That's what he wants to say. And he does say that, but in order to say that, the convention is to have it located somewhere. So he locates it in this mythical fight to the death, which I'm not going to go through again, which I could enjoy going through again, but I'm not going to do it. So the origin of self-consciousness for Hegel is a fight to the death for recognition. And some people call this a fight to the death for prestige, the willingness to risk everything. So a human being, for Hegel, can only be formed if two of the desires, or more, confront one another, and if each of the two is willing to go all the way. That is, if each is willing to risk their life in order to be recognized. If it's a fight to death, and in this fight, the fully human is formed. The fully human is formed by the side, or the person, we'll say person because he's speaking of two people, the one that recognizes fear. That's what's going to mark them as human. They're going to pull back. If they actually fought to death, no one would survive. Like one person would survive, and they would have no one to recognize them. So what marks it as human is the pullback according to fear. Otherwise, the survivor couldn't be recognized by the one killed. So for humanity, for human reality to arise in Hegel's mythical condition there, they both have to survive, but they can't survive as equals. So, but what the side, the person that's going to make the changes, that's going to develop and change the world, is the one who recognizes fear. The one who doesn't recognize fear is simply going to be a warrior. Which then, let's bracket that, because there's something else Hegel does. It becomes very important in the history of political thought, and that is how he sees human beings. So he sees human beings as engaged in action, as being afraid of death, as negating in their action. He also sees them as nothing but becoming. We are always becoming. That is, our human existence is always in time. It's historical. The fact that we're human, he says, now then he makes a run at a universal history. So the human reality overall is a universal history. But as humans, we are bodies in motion, in space, in time. constantly becoming, and we're becoming historically. For Hegel, this interaction is an interaction of becoming between mastery and bondage. The historical dialectic for Hegel in the time he is writing is a dialectic of independence and dominance, which becomes for Marx a dialectic of capitalist and worker. What makes a human human is recognition by another, by many others, by all others. Self-consciousness, I'm recapping, has to be recognized. That we will risk our lives to be recognized. And we have to be recognized by equals. So if we're not recognized by equals, we end up by being recognized by someone we don't recognize. So you could use this as an argument for equality. And then Hegel goes back to the fight for recognition. He says, after the fight for recognition, paradoxically, the winner, their desire isn't actualized. That they aren't a human recognized by an equal human. If desire can be satisfied only by recognition, then the bondsman will never be satisfied. And he does this twist. It's the very last, it's 196. The satisfied human is the one who's been a slave, been a bondsman, passed through slavery, bondsmanness, dependent consciousness, one who has overcome it dialectically through their action. So in fact, the master ends up being the dependent consciousness. For the master to exist, they're dependent upon those doing the work. The master's truth is that of the bondsman and the bondsman's work. The master's truth is that of the culture that's produced. 196. The truth of autonomous or independent consciousness is initially dependent consciousness that is passed through, has become a for itself, has negated what exists, and is part of becoming. So the satisfied human is one who's been a slave, passed through slavery, one who's overcome it dialectically, which leaves the master in the dependent consciousness position. Because their truth is really the truth of the ones doing the work, of the bondsman and of the bondsman's work, of the things of the world, the things that the bondsmen have created. Think of the pyramids as a good example. Or I think it's a good example. The truth of autonomous or independent consciousness is its opposite. There's a dialectical twist or flip there. Idle mastery is really nothing. It's an impasse. So, for Hegel, laborious slavery is the source of all human and social progress. Let me see if I do want to go through this. The slave finds autonomous consciousness in the other. The slave recognizes the other. The slave needs to be recognized by the other. The other is not recognizing them. So basically what you've got is an unequal relationship where the dependent consciousness is forced to recognize the independent consciousness. Forced to recognize it as an autonomous consciousness. So the slave position recognizes the other. Those in the slave position or dependent consciousness need to be recognized by the other, but they're not. And because they're not, because they're denied recognition, what happens to get recognition in order to get recognition, there has to be a negation. And a slave has to negate being a slave, which then allows writers on Hegel to say, the slave position structurally has the truth of negation there in it. And this truth of negation structurally is the fear of death. What you get through the fear is the melting in a way of fear through work. That's what they say. That everything fixed liquefies. The reality of slave consciousness in its negation and through its negation, you get a becoming, negation through work, negation through the liquefaction of fear, you get a becoming. You get a becoming of a for itself. So the trajectory is, in the beginning, if you want to say beginning, those in this, there was, okay, let me just do this. In the beginning, the bondsman was a bondsman of nature. In mastering nature through work, the bondsman frees herself from her own nature and from external nature. That is, work frees the bondsman, slave, dependent consciousness from nature, from one's own nature and from the nature of the master. What you get then is a different type of mastery. In the becoming of for itself of a dependent consciousness, you've got a different type of mastery. It's a mastery based on skill, on work, on activity, on transformation. It's what's called Bildung in German. It's self-creation and self-cultivation. That you become a master through self-creation and self-cultivation. That work forms and transforms nature and the world by humanizing it, and work transforms and cultivates the humans doing it. As self-cultivation, self-improvement. Remember, self-improvement is part of the Enlightenment. The education of humans through work creates history, which then allows you to say something very interesting. If the education of humans by work creates history, then work is time. It exists in time, it requires time, and then time is the history of the human in the world. Without the human, there would be no entity named time in the world. So time really ties into Hegel's dialectic here, not so much the structure, but the historical content in a way. That the dependent consciousness frees themselves through work, through time. But this abstract idea of freedom comes to the dependent consciousness through work. But in order to get to that, the first response is not to risk one's life. The first response is fear. So you've got, in the end, you've got Hegel's logic, the concept of logic, working itself out through history, or working itself out in history through the categories of being, negation, becoming. So being, and then he decides to take this and transplant. So if I was giving another lecture on Hegel, and I was going to give some of it, but I think I just have enough time to just give you 2 sentences. So the way Hegel then maps history onto this, he says, well, being up until the French Revolution, okay? So you're taking a look at ancient Greece, you're taking a look at Rome, you're taking a look at Stoicism, you're taking a look at Christianity. That's all kind of being up to the French Revolution. French Revolution is the negation of where people are in being. And then what happens after the French Revolution is you've got this negation of what went before, you get becoming, and the becoming is the modern state, which is like a real letdown after all of that. But for Hegel, the becoming is the modern state based on the Prussian state when he maps it onto history. He also goes through, the next thing he does in the book is he goes through slave ideologies. So he says Stoicism was really a problem because everybody became bored and indifferent, because Stoicism is great, but it's like, accept your lot where you are, Marx really is. So then you have Christianity, and Christianity gives you freedom and for itself, but not in this world, in infinitude. So then what you need is a revolution to change that, and the revolution is part of the French Revolution. He moves to that. Okay, I think that's enough here. So we got 4 people presenting. Why don't you be back by about 1/4 after? It's about 4 minutes after now.